I've watched enough of life to know that some stories don't begin with a grand hello, but with a quiet, unnoticed arrival. They start in the silence that follows a hope leaving a room, or in the stillness of a train platform after the last passenger has gone. We are, all of us, carrying a valise packed with the things we couldn't bear to leave behind and the vast, empty space of what we've already lost. We step into new places believing we are defined by that loss, by the rejection that set us on the road in the first place. We think the story is about what we are running from. But the truest stories, the ones that settle deep in your bones, are about the person who sees you standing there, holding what's left of your life in one hand, and doesn't turn away. This is a story for those who have ever felt overlooked, for anyone who has stood on a dusty platform and wondered if they were meant to be invisible. It's about a woman who believed her worth was a thing to be negotiated, and a man who had forgotten that a house is not a home until someone is waiting for the coffee to brew. The train pulled out of Thornfield, Montana, with a long, mournful sigh of steam, leaving behind a silence that was bigger than the sky. Ilara Standish stood on the raw lumber of the platform, her grip tight on the handle of her single, scuffed valise. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of dust, pine, and the distant promise of snow. It was a world away from the damp, rich soil of Ohio, a world away from the farm that was no longer hers. In her other hand, tucked under her arm, she held a leather-bound book, her mother's herb journal, its pages filled with pressed flowers and remedies for ailments of the body and the spirit. It was all that was left. Her gray wool dress, meticulously mended, felt too warm under the pale afternoon sun, and the dust was already settling on the toes of her sturdy boots. She had traveled for 6 days, each click of the rails a tick of a clock, counting down to this moment, to the start of a life she'd only read about in a neatly penned letter. Mr. Alistair Abernathy, a man who owned a mercantile, who sought a wife of plain and sturdy stock, and who had promised a life of respectability. She watched the empty track for a long moment before turning her attention to the town. Thornfield wasn't much more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. A mercantile, a smithy, a saloon already humming with low noise, and a hotel with faded paint. A man in a dusty hat was loading sacks of flour onto a wagon nearby, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her. No one did. She was just another shape against the vast, indifferent landscape. She smoothed the front of her dress, a nervous gesture she despised in herself, and waited. The letter had said he would meet the 3 o'clock train. Her grandmother's brass watch, pinned to her bodice, showed it was nearly half past. A knot of cold dread, familiar as an old friend, began to tighten in her stomach. Just then, a man emerged from the mercantile. He was slight and well-dressed in a dark suit, his bowler hat set at a precise angle. He consulted a pocket watch, his lips pursed in a thin line of impatience. This had to be him. He walked toward the platform, his gaze sweeping over her and then past her, as if searching for someone else. When his eyes returned to her, they held a flicker of distinct disappointment. He stopped a few feet away, his posture rigid. "Miss Standish?" he asked. His voice was as crisp and dry as autumn leaves. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her own voice steady, though her heart had begun a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She offered a small, polite nod. He gave her a clinical once-over, his eyes lingering on her hands, calloused from years of farm work, and the worn fabric of her valise. "Your photograph," he said, not as a question but as an accusation, "was taken some years ago, I presume." "5 years, sir," she said, "after my mother passed." He nodded, a sharp, dismissive jerk of his head. I see. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling around the corner of the station house. The man with the wagon had stopped his work, though he kept his back to them. He was listening. Ilara felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She had known this was a transaction, but she had not been prepared for the humiliation of being appraised like livestock and found wanting. My circumstances have shifted, Mr. Abernathy said, clearing his throat. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on a loose board at his feet. The advertisement was placed some months ago. I've since made an arrangement of a more suitable nature with a local family. He was telling her he'd found someone else, someone better, someone who wasn't standing on a train platform alone with dust on her boots and hope that was rapidly turning to ash. I see, Ilara said again. The words were small and inadequate, but they were all she had. She would not cry. She would not beg. She had learned long ago that composure was her only armor. I trust you have funds for your return passage, he said, his tone suggesting it was a foregone conclusion. I do not, she said plainly. The last of her money had paid for the ticket here. He sighed, a sound of profound irritation. He reached into his coat, produced a thin wallet, and extracted $2 silver. He held them out to her. This should secure a room at the hotel for a night. The station master can advise you on the next train heading east. He placed the coins on a nearby crate, as if unwilling to touch her hand. I wish you well, Miss Standish. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his mercantile, his back straight, his purpose clear. He had concluded his business. Ilara stood frozen, the 2 silver coins gleaming on the rough wood of the crate. The man with the wagon finally turned. His face was weathered, his eyes a startlingly clear blue under the brim of his worn hat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he watched her not with pity, but with a quiet, assessing gravity. He'd heard every word. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to disappear into the vast, empty sky, but she did not. She picked up the coins, her movements deliberate, and tucked them into her pocket. Then she picked up her valise and her mother's journal, and she took a deep breath of the thin, cold air. The man, Silas, had seen it all. He'd seen the way the little mercantile owner, Abernathy, had looked right through the woman, as if she were a pane of dusty glass. He'd seen the quiet dignity in her posture as she absorbed the blow, a stillness that spoke of a strength Abernathy wouldn't recognize if it bit him. He saw her hands, which were not delicate but capable, and the way she held the worn book to her chest like a shield. When Abernathy walked away, leaving her stranded, something in Silas that had been dormant for years stirred. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of grudging respect. He finished loading the last of his supplies, sacks of oats, coffee, a bolt of canvas, and led his 2 draft horses to the edge of the platform. Ilara was still standing there, looking out at the endless expanse of brown hills and distant, snow-dusted mountains. She seemed to be gathering herself, deciding which direction a person with nowhere to go should walk. "Ma'am," Silas said. His voice was low and gravelly, unused to making conversation. She turned, her expression guarded. Her eyes were the color of moss after a rain, and they held no trace of tears. "Sir." "That was a poor showing," he stated simply. It wasn't an offer of sympathy, just a fact. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed her face. "Mr. Abernathy is entitled to his preferences." Her voice was tight, but it did not waver. "He's entitled to be a fool, I reckon," Silas said, adjusting a harness on one of the horses. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Town like this, a man's word ought to mean something." He paused his work and finally met her gaze. "You have a place to stay?" "The hotel for tonight," she said, her chin lifting a fraction. She wouldn't show this stranger her desperation. "And after that?" he pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. The truth was a hard, bitter stone in her throat. "I am a capable worker. I can cook, clean, mend, and I know a great deal about animal husbandry and gardening." She was reciting her qualifications, the very things her letter to Abernathy had detailed. "I imagine I can find employment." Silas considered her for a long moment. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but also the unyielding set of her jaw. He thought of his cabin, of the silence that had filled it for 3 years. A silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. He thought of the dust on the mantelpiece, the stack of unmended shirts, the cold hearth. He hadn't wanted anyone in that space. He had guarded his solitude like a fortress. But leaving this woman to the mercy of Thornfield, to the leering eyes in the saloon or the false piety of the church ladies, felt like a different kind of failure. It felt wrong. "I need a housekeeper," he said, the words surprising him as much as they did her. "My place is out of town. Small cabin. It's quiet." Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for his angle, for the hidden price. "What are the terms?" "Room and board? $10 a month," he said, naming a fair wage. "You'd cook, keep the place clean. The work is honest." She was quiet for a long time, weighing his offer against the vast emptiness of her other options. The $2 silver in her pocket felt impossibly small. "I would not be an imposition," she said finally, her voice low. "I am accustomed to hard work and little space. I could sleep in the barn, if there is one. A corner of a tack room would be sufficient." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. She was offering to make herself as small as possible, to take up no space at all, because a man with a clean suit had decided she was unworthy of it. A slow, hot anger burned in his chest. At Abernathy, at the world that had worn this woman down to this. He shook his head, a single firm motion. "There's a spare room, small, but it has a bed and a window." He turned his gaze to the horizon, his jaw tight. "You'll sleep in the house. I'll take the barn." Elara stared at him, her composure finally cracking for just a second. A wave of disbelief washed over her face. He was offering her the comfort of the house, while taking the rougher lodging for himself. It was an act of decency so unexpected, it left her speechless. No one had offered her such a simple, profound courtesy in a very long time. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Silas shrugged, turning back to his wagon. He picked up her valise and the worn journal, his large, calloused hand gentle with the book, and placed them carefully among the sacks of flour. "It's the proper way," he said, as if that explained everything. He didn't offer his hand to help her up, but he waited, giving her the space to climb onto the wagon seat herself. She did, settling herself on the hard wooden bench. He climbed up beside her, the bench groaning under his weight. He clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, pulling away from the station and the small, humiliating chapter that had just closed, and heading out toward the vast, unknown country. The arrangement was struck with the quiet finality of a door latch clicking into place. For the first few days, they moved around each other like cautious animals in a shared enclosure. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, built of rough-hewn pine that smelled perpetually of wood smoke and the dry earth. It was clean but stark, bearing the unmistakable mark of a man living alone. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few tin plates and cups. The room Silas had indicated as hers was little more than a closet with a narrow cot and a small window that looked out onto the endless prairie. It was more than she'd had the night before. He was true to his word. That first evening, after a supper of biscuits and bacon eaten in near total silence, he'd taken a blanket and a pillow from a chest and headed for the door. "The barn is warm enough," he'd said, not looking at her. "The horses keep the chill off." And he was gone, leaving her alone in the small circle of lamplight, the silence of the house pressing in on her. It felt wrong, this reversal. She was the one who was here on sufferance, the one who should be taking the lesser space. But his quiet insistence had been absolute, a wall she could not argue against. So she'd washed the few dishes, banked the fire, and retreated to her small room, lying awake for hours listening to the wind and the unfamiliar sounds of the night. The next morning, she was up before dawn. She found the coffee beans and the grinder, filling the cabin with a rich, welcoming aroma. When Silas came in from the barn, his hair damp with morning dew, he stopped in the doorway. The fire was already crackling, and a pot of coffee was steaming on the stove. He just stood there for a beat, his expression unreadable. He took the cup she offered him without a word, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. It was the first time they had touched, and so their life found its rhythm, a silent dance of shared space and unspoken needs. Ilara learned the geography of his habits. He rose before the sun, worked until dusk, and came in for meals with a weariness that settled deep in his bones. He was a man of profound quietness, his words as sparse and carefully chosen as winter rations. She, in turn, dedicated herself to her side of the bargain. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed. She mended the stack of his torn work shirts, her stitches small and neat. She discovered his small vegetable patch behind the cabin, overgrown with weeds, and set about reviving it, her hands finding comfort in the familiar work of turning soil. Using her mother's journal, she identified wild thyme and sage growing in the hills, and soon the cabin began to smell of roasting meat seasoned with fresh herbs, a scent of home that had long been absent. She learned to read the man in the things he did, not the things he said. Every morning, there was a neat stack of freshly split firewood by the door, enough to last her the day so she wouldn't have to go out to the woodpile. He never started eating until she had sat down at the table, a small courtesy that felt monumental. One afternoon, she returned from a walk to find a small bunch of purple wildflowers sitting in a tin cup on the table. He never acknowledged them, and she never mentioned them, but they stayed there until they wilted, a spot of color in the monochrome world of the cabin. She unpacked her few belongings, spreading a small embroidered runner her mother had made on the rough wooden table. It was her only piece of beauty, a link to a life that felt a world away. The first time Silas saw it, he stopped as he came in for supper, his gaze fixed on the delicate blue flowers stitched into the linen. His jaw tightened for a moment, a flicker of some deep, hidden pain in his eyes. He said nothing, but that night, the silence at the table felt heavier, freighted with a history she did not know. She learned his grief was a tangible thing, a third presence in the small cabin. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him moving in the barn, a restless pacing. She never asked. He never offered. They orbited this central, unspoken sadness, their small acts of care the only language they shared. He was providing her with shelter. She was providing him with a well-kept home. It was an arrangement. But as the weeks turned into a month, as the prairie grass turned from green to gold, Ilara found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch and realized, with a jolt of alarm, that the silence in the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting. The first snows came early that year, dusting the high peaks in late October before sweeping down into the valley in a furious white squall. The wind howled for 2 days, a mournful beast clawing at the stout walls of the cabin. Silas had spent the day before the storm hit riding the fence lines, checking on the cattle, his face grim with the knowledge of what was coming. He'd left at dawn with a simple instruction: keep the fire high. Don't let it go out. Ilara had spent the day in a flurry of activity, her movements a counterpoint to the storm's chaos. She baked bread, the scent of yeast and warmth a defiant stand against the cold. She made a thick beef stew, letting it simmer for hours on the back of the stove until the meat was tender and the gravy rich. She checked the window every few minutes, peering through the swirling snow for any sign of him. The sun set early, the world outside dissolving into a churning vortex of gray and white. Darkness fell, and still, he did not return. She lit a lantern and placed it in the window, a small, hopeful beacon against the immense, roaring dark. She kept the stew warm, adding a little water to keep it from scorching. She kept the coffee pot hot. The hours ticked by on her grandmother's watch. 8 o'clock. 9. 10. The wind shrieked, rattling the window pane in its frame. A knot of fear, cold and tight, formed in her chest. She imagined him lost, his horse fallen, the cold seeping into his bones. She banked the fire high, just as he'd told her, the logs hissing and popping. She sat in the chair by the hearth, her mother's journal open on her lap, though she could not read. She just listened. It was nearly midnight when she heard it, a heavy, stumbling sound on the porch, followed by the fumbling of a hand at the latch. The door blew open on a gust of wind and snow, and he staggered in, a figure made of ice and exhaustion. His hat was gone, his coat and beard were caked with snow, and his face was a pale bluish white. "Silas," she breathed, rushing to his side. He swayed on his feet, his eyes glazed with fever or cold. "The calf got separated from its mother," he mumbled, his words slurring. "Had to carry it back." He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering. She helped him shrug off the frozen coat, the fabric stiff as board. Underneath, his shirt was soaked through. She guided him to the chair by the fire, his weight heavy against her. He sank into it with a groan, his body slumping. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She pulled off his wet boots and socks, chafing his frozen feet with her hands. She ladled a bowl of the hot stew, holding the spoon to his lips when his hands shook too badly to hold it himself. He ate mechanically, his gaze fixed on the fire. As the warmth began to seep back into him, his shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, weary lethargy, his head lolled to the side. She draped a thick wool blanket over him. As she tucked it around his shoulders, his eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, looking at her but seeing something else entirely. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a rough, broken thing. "You kept the light on. Always. Kept it on." The name hung in the air between them, stark and sudden. Sarah. Ilara froze, her hands still on the blanket. So that was her name. The name of the ghost who lived in this cabin with them, who owned the sadness in his eyes. He thought she was someone else. A wave of complicated emotion washed over her. A pang of sorrow for this unknown woman. A sharp, surprising sting of something that felt like jealousy. And a deep, aching tenderness for the broken man in front of her. His eyes closed again, and he slipped into an exhausted sleep. Ilara stood there for a long time, watching the firelight play across his worn face. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the carefully constructed walls of their arrangement had just been breached. The silence was no longer just quiet. It was filled with a name. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that nothing would be the same. He had mistaken her for the woman he'd lost, and in that moment of confusion, he had revealed the depth of the void she had unknowingly begun to fill. The days following the blizzard were steeped in a new and fragile tension. Silas recovered quickly, his constitution as tough as the landscape he inhabited. But the memory of his delirious whisper lingered in the air between them. He was more withdrawn than ever, his quietness now laced with a kind of mortified shame. He wouldn't meet her eye, and their brief exchanges over meals became even more clipped and functional. He had let her see a crack in his armor, and now he was working furiously to seal it shut. But the name, Sarah, had been spoken. It had given a shape to the grief that permeated the small cabin, turning it from a vague sadness into a specific, heartfelt loss. Ilara said nothing about it. She continued her work, her routine a steadying rhythm in the awkward silence. But she saw things differently now. She noticed the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the embroidered runner on the table, the one that had made his jaw tighten, and she understood. She saw the single, faded quilt on her own cot, finer work than anything else in the cabin, and realized it must have been Sarah's. She was sleeping under the ghost's blanket, living in the space she had left behind. The thought should have made her feel like an intruder, but instead, it fostered a strange, quiet kinship with the woman she would never know. Sarah had loved this man. She had kept a light in the window for him, too. About a week after the storm, the awkwardness became unbearable. It was evening, and the fire was casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ilara was mending one of his shirts by the lamplight, and Silas was staring into the flames, a tin cup of coffee held untouched in his hands. The silence was so thick she could feel it. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I owe you an apology." Ilara looked up from her sewing. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were unwell." "I spoke a name," he said, still not looking at her. "It wasn't right." "It was your wife's name, wasn't it?" she asked gently, setting her sewing aside. He gave a slow, heavy nod. The admission seemed to cost him something. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into cold water. "Sarah, she's been gone 3 years." He finally turned to look at her, and in the flickering light, she saw the raw, unguarded grief in his eyes. The fortress walls were down. "This cabin," he said, gesturing around the small room. "This was for the foreman. The main house is up on the rise." He nodded toward the window. "I haven't set foot in it since she died." Ilara's eyes widened. She had assumed this small, rough dwelling was the entirety of his ranch. She had seen the larger structure on the hill, dark and silent, and assumed it belonged to someone else, or was abandoned. "She died there," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "In childbirth. The baby, a boy. He didn't make it either. The snow was bad that year, too." The doctor couldn't get through from Thornfield in time. I should have gone for him sooner. I thought we had more time. The story tumbled out of him, ragged and broken. He spoke of the house he had built for her with his own hands, of the cradle he had carved that now sat empty in a dusty room. He spoke of a life filled with laughter and plans, a life that had ended in a single, silent, snow-filled night. He had not just lost his wife and child, he had lost himself. He had walled himself off in this small cabin, living a half-life, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. His ranch, she now understood, was one of the largest in the valley, but he was living like a hired hand on his own land, punishing himself with solitude. When he finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the telling. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the weight he had carried alone for so long. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. She simply met his vulnerable gaze with her own steady one. "My parents died of fever 2 years ago," she said softly. "One after the other. We lost the farm a year later. The herb journal is all I have left of my mother. Some days the quiet is the hardest part." It was a simple offering, a small piece of her own story laid beside his. It was not a comparison of grief, but a simple acknowledgement of it. A shared understanding. In that moment, they were no longer just a rancher and his housekeeper. They were two people who had lost their way, who had found themselves sharing a small, warm space in the vast, cold wilderness. He held her gaze for a long moment, and for the first time she saw not just his sorrow, but a flicker of something else. Gratitude. He had shared his deepest wound, and she had not flinched. She had simply held the space for him, and in doing so, had made it a little less lonely. The winter thawed slowly, grudgingly, giving way to a Montana spring that painted the brown hills with strokes of pale green. The air grew warmer, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Something inside the cabin was thawing too. The confession by the fire had changed the current between them, replacing the awkward tension with a quiet, fragile intimacy. They spoke more, not much, but enough. He would tell her about his day, about a new calf or a fence that needed mending. She would tell him about the wild onions she'd found by the creek, or how the vegetable garden was sprouting. They were small, ordinary conversations, but they felt like bridges being built across a vast silence. He started taking his meals in the house again, instead of retreating to the barn as soon as supper was over. He would linger by the fire, watching her read from her mother's journal or mend his clothes, the comfortable quiet settling around them like a familiar blanket. He stopped sleeping in the barn. One night, without a word of discussion, he simply unrolled his bedroll on the floor by the hearth. It was another unspoken shift, another step toward a life that felt less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. Ilara felt the change in herself, too. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for years had begun to recede. She woke up in the morning not with a sense of dread, but with a quiet purpose. She found herself humming as she worked, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had a home. It wasn't the one she had planned, but it was real. It was built of shared meals and stacked firewood, and a man who looked at her now with something other than just assessment in his clear blue eyes. One morning in early May, the world felt new. A Chinook wind had blown through, melting the last of the snow and leaving the air soft and warm. Ilara had the cabin door propped open, letting the fresh air sweep through. Silas stood on the porch, sipping the coffee she'd handed him, looking out at the greening valley. He was usually gone by this time, already out on the range, But today, he lingered. He finished his coffee and set the tin cup down on the porch rail. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Ilara," he said. Her name in his mouth still felt new, a sound she was just getting used to. "The arrangement we made, it was for the winter. The roads are clear now. The stage runs regular from Thornfield. You're free to go if you wish. I could give you your wages and enough for passage wherever you want to go." Her heart gave a painful lurch. He was letting her go. After everything, after the shared silences and the tentative steps toward connection, he was offering her an exit. The old fear, the fear of being unwanted, rushed back in, cold and sharp. She gripped the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles white. She couldn't read his face. Was this what he wanted? "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "No," he said, the word raw and certain. "That ain't what I want." He took a step closer into the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "This place, it's been a shell for 3 years, just a place to sleep. Since you've been here, I've grown accustomed to the house feeling like a home again. I've grown accustomed to you." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently run a finger along the cover of her mother's journal, which sat on the table just inside the door. "I'm not asking you to replace anyone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, she'll always be a part of this place, a part of me. But my life didn't end when hers did. I just started living like it did." He finally met her eyes, and all the grief and solitude she had seen there before was now joined by a hesitant, powerful hope. "I'm asking you to stay, Ilara, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." The words hung in the warm spring air. She stared at him, speechless. This quiet, broken man was offering her everything. A home, a future, a place beside him. He was choosing her. Not out of necessity, not out of pity, but because he wanted her. Her. Ilara Standish, the plain woman with the calloused hands who had been left on a train platform. Tears welled in her eyes. The tears she had refused to shed for Mr. Abernathy, for her lost farm, for all her lonely years. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. She couldn't find her voice, so she just nodded, a small, jerky movement. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, transforming his rugged features, making him look younger, lighter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its surface smoothed by countless hours of whittling. He placed it gently in her open palm. "I'm not much for fancy things," he said. "But I made this for you. I figured maybe we could start building a new nest. Together." She closed her hand around the small bird, its wooden form solid and real against her skin. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of all the hope she thought she had lost forever. "Yes. And so, you see, a life can be rebuilt. It doesn't always happen with a grand design or a shouted declaration. Sometimes it's built quietly, one small gesture at a time. A stack of wood by the door, a pot of coffee kept warm, a light left in a window during a storm. Some loves don't arrive like a flash flood, but seep in slowly, like spring rain into dry ground, until one day you realize everything is green again." Ilara and Silas didn't replace the past. They made room for it, and then they built something new beside it. They opened up the big house on the hill, and its silence was finally filled not with ghosts, but with the quiet sounds of a life being lived. The murmur of conversation, the scent of baking bread, and eventually, the laughter of children. Their story is a reminder that the person who is meant for you won't ask you to be smaller. They won't ask you to sleep in the barn. They will give you the best room in the house, and in doing so, they will show you that you were worthy of it all along. They will see the strength in your calloused hands and the courage in your quiet composure, and they will choose you, not in spite of your journey, but because of it. If this story found a place in your heart today, if you've ever known what it means to start over in an unfamiliar place, I'd be so grateful if you'd let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's a comfort to know we're all out here, sharing these stories together. And if you'd like to hear more tales like this one, consider subscribing. It helps these stories find the people who need them most. May you find kindness where you least expect it, and may you always recognize a home when you feel it.